welcome to four fantastic women of action. Joining us from Ontario, Canada, Rotary International President nominee Jennifer Jones, and Rotary International Director and incoming Rotary International Vice President Valerie Wafer. As many of you know, Jennifer will be the first woman to lead Rotary International in about a year from now. We're also delighted to have joining us from Alaska, the first woman appointed to the Rotary Foundation Board of Trustees, Carolyn Jones, and from California, the woman who blazed a trail for all women in Rotary, first female president of a Rotary Club, Sylvia Whitlock. Their accomplishments are many and our time is short, so I'll refer you to the event website for their complete biographies. Director Valerie, I hope you and your fantastic panel hear the thunderous virtual applause. So let's get the conversation started. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, District Governor Mary. It is truly an honor to be here today to celebrate 75 years of Rotary and the United Nations. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has appealed to all governments and societies to build a world where no one has to be afraid because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. A top priority for Rotary is growing and diversifying our membership to make sure that we reflect the communities we serve and are inclusive to all cultures, experiences, and identities. In the journey of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Rotary International has stepped forward to raise awareness, visibility, and the voices of its dedicated members in the quest to include underrepresented groups in roles of leadership, those currently present, and those not present in our organization. So my first question, let's open this up. Can you share an example of how you have leaned in when others at the table may not have wanted you to speak up? Jennifer, let's start with you.
For as many steps forward as we've taken, there's still a lot that we need to do. And so from a personal perspective, yes, of course, there's been times. I think of times when I've been approached inappropriately, whether it's by comment or gesture. I think of working with others, not necessarily in our organization, but even in my vocational life, where I've been told to be different because the way I wasn't perhaps the way that was going to be the best way forward. And I think that it takes a lot of interpersonal strength to be able to say, no, I'm going to define who I am the way I am, and I'm going to be that way. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we're as authentic as possible as the example for others that follow us.
Thank you, Jennifer. You are a true example and one that I am proud to follow and call you my mentor. So thank you so much. Carolyn, can you give us an example of how you leaned in when others at the table might not have wanted you to speak up?
There are many. It's hard to sort out, but my favorite and first probably had to do with the fact that my Rotary District was responsible for extending Rotary into Eastern Russia starting in the 1990s. This was at a time when Russia itself was in upheaval, leaving its communism politics to whatever was next. And Rotary saw an opportunity to bring new Rotarians into the fold. They sent out a notice to several different districts that were close to Russia. We're separated by the Pacific Ocean, but we were the only one who responded positively. And so it was in 1997, in May, 6 weeks before I was to become district governor, that I accompanied the then district governor to Siberia to charter 4 Rotary clubs. At the last club in Tomsk, my host asked me if I could take time out to come to their cancer hospital. Tomsk is next door to a town called Seversk, where there is a nuclear power plant, and there had been lots of leaks. And a lot of the children were showing up in the hospital with leukemia and other forms of cancers of the blood. While the doctors had a procedure for treating this, it had been a couple of years since they'd last received any of their dollar stipend from the federal government. So they didn't have the means to buy the medicine to treat these kids. And My host was hoping that if I went with him to the hospital, I would be moved to make something happen through Rotary. I did go. I met 5 children and their mothers who had moved into the hospital to take care of the kids. They thanked me for coming and thinking about them. I went back that night to the charter ceremony and told all the Rotarians what I'd seen. And what I learned was it wasn't just the children who had cancer who were in distress. All the children in Russia were distressed in the 90s because they were at the bottom of the list of how government money was going to be spent. And they were orphaned, they were abandoned, they were without education, they were homeless, they were without clothing, you name it, everything you can think of, these kids didn't have. I went back home, I told my district, and in 6 weeks we came up with what we called the Children of Russia Project. And we advertised it within the district and outside of the district to help children in Eastern Russia. And based on the suggestions from our 22 clubs in Eastern Russia, we were able to raise over $600,000 and finance 30 matching foundation grants to help kids in Eastern Russia. That was not definitely on my roadmap of what I'd do as a governor that year, but it's hard to say no. And I found out that Rotarians worldwide have a soft spot for children, and they stepped up.
Incredible effort. Thank you, Carolyn. Sylvia, you are the mighty mouse that roared. Tell us how you leaned in.
Well, that was a lean. That was a lean in. We leaned in because when we were invited to join Rotary way back in 1976, Rotary didn't take very kindly to that. Once they found out that there were women in the Rotary Club, they sent someone to take our charter away. And they said, you can no longer call yourself a Rotary Club. So we stopped calling ourselves a Rotary Club. We called ourselves the ex-Rotary Club of Duarte. And we continued to do Rotary things, except we didn't do any international projects because we didn't have Rotary's blessing. But we continued to do everything in the community that had made Rotary such a strong presence in that community, even though Rotary International disapproved of the fact that there were women. We couldn't understand why, with a motto like service above self, the idea of women doing service was not appealing to the Rotarians whose selves were saying, we don't want women in this Rotary Club. And they themselves prevailed really for 11 years while they took us to one court, to the Superior Court. When we lost the case in the Superior Court and we appealed to the Appellate Court, we won the case. They reversed the Superior Court. And, that's the year I was going to be president of our ex-Rotary Club. Remember, we're not Rotary anymore, we're ex-Rotary. So I became the president of the ex-Rotary Club of Duarte while Rotary International continued to fight. And of course, they took the case all the way to SCOTUS, to the United States Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court, in its wisdom and being really aware of the civil rights aspect of that action, ruled in favor of the Rotary Club of Duarte, and women became a presence in Rotary. But that was huge leaning in, and we had to have a sense of humor about it. Because if we had been serious and gone away because we were maybe a little bit disheartened by what was going on, well, probably there would not have been women in Rotary today. But we stayed there. We acted, although the bylaw said Rotarians had to be persons of integrity, and in the beginning it said men of integrity. So that was a huge lean in, and everything was a lean in for 11 years. It took 11 years of leaning. Can you believe that? If you had a child who was 10 years old when this started, by the time this was over, that child was 21. And weren't you concerned about the kind of world you were preparing for that child to grow up in? If that were a girl, what would she feel about the regard for women in her world? So we think we killed many, many birds with one stone when we laid in on the move to get women into voting. Okay.
Well, I thank each of you for leaning in and getting us to where we are today. Let's move on to the next question. How can your Rotary family apply the lessons you've learned to amplify the voices of the underrepresented groups in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals? Carolyn, let's start with you.
Okay. That's a big question.
It is.
And I would start by saying, Rotary family, don't leave it to serendipity for this to happen. If you want this to happen, in the words of past president and former president Frank Devlin, you have to be proactive. I think you need to begin by having an agenda and specifically state that your agenda includes diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next, identify the people that you want from the recognized groups in the community to be a part of implementing the agenda, whether it's teachers, religious leaders, shopkeepers, students. Give them a role in the planning, the speaking, and the action, and then invite them to the party. But once you get them there, make sure you get them on the dance floor as well.
Thank you, Carolyn. Sylvia, what are your thoughts?
You should ask me that question because I worked for the United Nations for 8 years, the Secretariat. And and do they believe in DEI? Well, let's look around and see. One of the things that I learned, I probably knew it in the back of my head all along, was that we have an ERA, an Equal Rights Amendment for women, that was first proposed way back in 1923. You know, it's never been made an amendment to the Constitution. Why is that? Well, you know, it expires and they breathe life into it again, and it expires and they breathe. And maybe that will happen again because this year, we'll just talk about the Sustainable Development Goal. Besides gender equity, there are 16 other goals. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I belong to a group called UNA USA, United Nations Association in USA, and we work on advocating for all those goals, and among them, gender equity is a huge one. There are things, you know, there are things in this world that women have a part to, that women know about, that men don't know about, that men may have a feeling about, but that women can deal with. A lot of issues around health, a lot of issues around sanitation, a lot of issues about where women live. And so it's to our advantage to have women involved and women empowered. We don't have as many women in the political arena as we should. We have more than we did 10 years ago. And maybe we'll even get the ERA to move towards being an amendment one day soon. But we need them because their voices need to be heard. It's not just one voice. There are two voices that need to be heard. So I think it's important to have women here where they need to be.
Thank you. Jennifer, let's round out this question with you.
Well, I think that in order for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular the one that we're talking about with gender equity and gender balance, is that we have to be intentional. And that's a really big part, the intention to make a difference, that we have to call it out, we have to own it, and we have to put steps in place to create a landscape for change. And so I applaud, for example, our incoming president, Shekhar Mehta from India, who's made it a priority during his term as president to elevate the conversation about empowering women and girls. And, you know, to make sure that in doing so, putting that out as a priority, it's giving permission perhaps to some who might not have ever thought of this, to the leadership that he's looking to inspire, to each of us to say that maybe there's a part of this conversation that we can have, that we need to play a role in and challenge our own inner dialogue, each of us. Being intentional is also establishing for us as an organization our DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force for our organization, creating a DEI statement that talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion and what it means to us as an organization.
It's a very exciting journey that we're on. The conversation that we're hearing in our Rotary clubs and our districts is changing every single day and changing for the better around diversity, equity, inclusion. So really happy and excited to be part of the journey and excited to be part of an organization right now that is really has this front and center in their conversation. And we know that we're going to establish an organization that our children and our grandchildren, especially our daughters and our granddaughters, will want to be part of. And that's very exciting. The Rotary International Board in 2019 set a goal to have representation of 30% of women in Rotary and in leadership positions by the year 2023. The current global representation stands at 23%. Now, goals are important to show intent and leadership, but 2023 is only 2 years away. So how do we get there? Carolyn, you were the first woman on the Rotary Foundation board. What was that experience like, and how do we move forward? How do we get to 30%?
As to your main question, I don't mean to throw a curve to you and Jennifer, but I want to throw the answer back to both of you. Because in my time as being a Rotary leader, I've always believed you should lead by example. And I've tried never to ask any Rotarian to do something that I wasn't willing to do myself. So it's at the top level of Rotary that you've set this 30% goal. And I think that if you want to make this happen in such a short time, it's the directors and the trustees that have to truly buy into it, not merely as a vote, but what they're going to do. There are some countries where we have lots of women. My country, the United States. There are some countries where we have woefully few or none. But we have directors sometimes from some of those countries with the woefully few or none. So this is a challenge to them. What are you as directors going to truthfully do to go back to your constituency and say it's time to bring more women into Rotary? They should be inviting women to visit the clubs. They should be inviting women to be program speakers. They should be consulting with the women in their country about how they can get them to be interested in Rotary. And then you should look at the few women that are in these woefully few countries and ask them, how is it that they were invited? Why do they think that other women have not been invited? What took you so long to join Rotary? And I think if the top starts and leads, that then they can get the message out, and clubs and districts may be more willing to follow. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step.
So, I mean, Carolyn, challenge accepted. You're absolutely right. We need to lead by example. And I think it also takes some leadership on our part as well, because one of the things that we're doing as an RI board is we're looking at making the roles more doable so that we can attract younger leaders as well. But here's the really exciting thing. The future leaders of our organization have got it figured out. The Rotaractors already have globally 45% women representation. And in North America and the Caribbean, we're at 54% women representation in Rotaractors. So, the Rotaractors are definitely going to hold us accountable, and so they should. And so I really do see that changing. And as Jennifer said, and you've also eloquently said, that, the more we have women in leadership roles, the more people will step up and realize that this is available to them as well. And I think sometimes in the 116 years of our organization, there was the perception that it didn't matter how hard you work, which positions you had, perhaps you wouldn't be considered for some of these leadership positions. So again, I think it's a really great time. I'm going to roll on to our last. Oh, Sylvia, do you have something?
I just wanted to add something to that. When our club invited women into Rotary, and Rotary didn't like it, they took our charter away. Now the Rotary bylaws say that a club may not be chartered unless its membership is open to both men and women. And there are clubs who openly say they don't want women members. Now, what kind of strength is Rotary putting behind what they've said? That's another question to consider.
Mm-hmm.
If I could comment on that, because it's an interesting dynamic. There's and it's one that I've been digging into recently. And I don't want to do a deep dive on this, but it's a delicate balancing act on how to deal with this. because not only are there male-only clubs that are being chartered, but there are a lot of female-only clubs that are being chartered as well. And when I say that it's delicate, is that in some parts of our world, there are women formed clubs because they don't feel comfortable joining in a Rotary club that is comprised of all men for whatever reason. They don't feel safe, they don't feel respected, they don't feel that they're being taken seriously. So they are forming their own clubs too. And so how to deal with this is challenging.
Rule says it's open to both men and women. Doesn't say you have to have them when it's chartered. Just says it's open. So if they're available, that they're acceptable.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So let's move on to our last question. Rotary's area of focus and the Sustainable Development Goals align and build positive peace by improving daily life for everyone, everywhere. You have all traveled the world on behalf of Rotary and seen the amazing work supported by our organization. What is your Rotary moment from these adventures? Sylvia, let's go to you.
You know, I've had so many Rotary moments, and I've really traveled the world. But I have to tell you, you know, I grew up at a time when polio was rampant. I had students in my high school who got polio. I was in New York City when swimming pools were closed because there was polio around and children couldn't go into the pools. So when I went on my first NIDS, my first campaign in India to give polio inoculations, for me, it was a huge feeling knowing that I was going to put some drops in some child's mouth that would prevent him from getting the spread disease and eventually wipe out the spread disease. But when I went to Delhi, I was with a group of women who had a list of the children in the neighborhood, and they were going and knocking at doors and giving inoculations. And we went to this house. It was a 2-story house, and the woman who answered the doorbell leaned over the balcony, and they told her what they wanted, and she came down and her child was inoculated. And she said, you know, I have a neighbor upstairs who had a baby, but just 3 weeks ago. He's probably not on the list. And they said, okay, call her. And she brought that baby down, and that baby was inoculated, and my heart just rose. I couldn't believe that. Here we are. We're doing everything we can to make sure we meet the needs of a country, a world that's hurting, being hurt by polio. So that was a big moment for me. I have many moments, but that one I keep remembering. I keep going back to that. I see the little baby coming down, and I see that doing it. That was my Rotary moment.
I think any of us who have experienced that, Sylvia, you just took us right back there. And I got some chills because I had an opportunity to give the first drops to a very young baby as well. And I'll never forget that moment. It was incredible. Carolyn, how about you? Would you like to share with us your Rotary moment from an adventure?
One of many, yes, had to do with the fact that my Rotary District was responsible for extending Rotary into Eastern Russia starting in the 1990s. This was at a time when Russia itself was in upheaval. At the last club in Tomsk, my host asked me if I could take time out to come to their cancer hospital. Tomsk is next door to a town called Siversk, where there is a nuclear power plant, and there had been lots of leaks, and a lot of the children were showing up in the hospital with leukemia and other forms of cancers of the blood. The whole project began because of meeting the children who had cancer. That was in 97. I was back in Eastern Russia in 2000 as a Rotary volunteer, and the hospital invited me to come for a visit. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but they had invited those children back. And they'd come in from the villages with their parents, and they said, Carolyn, we don't have cancer anymore. Oh. I said I was a Rotary volunteer that year. I was at an orphanage, and I got to know those children really well. I returned there 4 more times. That was in the early 2000s. 3 years ago, I danced at the wedding of one of those children. So it's moments like that that makes me really happy to be a part of the Rotary family.
Oh, goodness. I'm so glad this is our last question because I'm going to be in tears very soon. It's incredible to hear these stories. Jennifer, what's your Rotary moment from a travel?
Like my fellow friends, there's so many of them, and in reflecting upon it, I selected one about being part of a small group of Rotary volunteers, and we were in Venezuela, and there to perform, joining a medical team, and who was there to perform cleft lip and cleft palate surgeries, and that a life could be altered in the course of 1 hour so profoundly. And in countries like that, children who were born with a cleft lip or cleft palate are often thought to be they're ostracized and just discarded. And so this is such an incredible opportunity to see a life changed. And there was a little 11-month-old baby who came into our surgical suite, and the family, a young fisherman and his wife, had traveled literally 14 hours by foot, by bus, by car to get there. And the baby went into the operating room, and I was sitting with the mom and dad, and they spoke only Spanish, and I don't speak any Spanish. And so we just sat there as human beings together, and just waiting on pins and needles for their baby to come out. And the surgeon came out afterward with the baby and said that everything had gone well, and brought the baby out and put her into her mom's arms. And through a translator, she looked up at me and she said, "I've always thought that my baby was beautiful, but now the rest of the world can see what I see." And it was just such a beautiful moment. Again, all of us in tears, and that her little life just changed, and to be part of something like that, it was truly, it was a moment I'll never forget.
I don't think it's a coincidence that you each spoke about making an impact on the lives of children, because we know when we change a children's life or save a children's life, we're saving the family as well. And we're allowing them to grow up and be productive citizens and give everything that they've got. And thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today. I think that we actually have come to the end of our time. It has been a true honor to be with the three of you today, to celebrate the 75 years of Rotary in the United Nations, and to just have a conversation about empowering of women and how we can lean in and make a difference. So thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you each for your answers and your sharing of your personal stories. It was a true pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Bye-bye.